Beethoven's Fidelio is more than an opera. It is music's supreme expression of personal and political freedom. In Beethoven's day, at the Congress of Vienna, it was taken as a protest against Napoleon. Since then, it has come to speak for every victim of oppression, every prisoner of every prison camp. To some extent, famous performances of Fidelio have written the moral history of my generation. Toscanini's Fidelio in Salzburg in 1937 was a final affirmation of the dignity of humankind before Hitler sent his troops into the city. Bruno Walter's 1941 Met performances were an Allied expression of solidarity and hope as thousands of refugees fled to America. After the war, Furtwängler's Salzburg Fidelio was a passionate declaration that some had practiced under the very shadow of Hitler, the humanity that others had preached from the safety of other shores. It was a plea for reconciliation as hostilities ended. Then Kirsten Flagstad, who had left America in 1941 to be with her husband in occupied Norway, returned 10 years later to face the hostile crowds who accused her of collaborating with the Nazis. To sing Fidelio at the Met under Bruno Walter, that fellow artist at least did not think her a collaborator, and to prove the point that it can be an act of heroism for a woman to stand at her husband's side. Another woman who stood by her husband's side was Galina Vishnevskaya, who sang in the first Fidelio staged in the Soviet Union, a year after the death of Stalin in 1954. The libretto passed every stage of censorship, but, as the rehearsals went on, she recalled, I realized more and more that this was about us in Soviet society. I was calling on the people to release those unjustly imprisoned and punish the wicked. It was a moment that changed my life. Eventually, the feelings it released led to her and her husband, Mstislav Rostropovich, being deprived of their citizenship and leaving the USSR. But they stayed together. It was the Soviet Union that changed. The liberation of Vienna and the reopening of its Staatsoper in 1955 were marked again by Fidelio, conducted by Karl Böhm. That was the now legendary performance at which several thousand people stood outside the opera house through the afternoon and then into the night, listening to the music on loudspeakers. The Viennese tell how miracles happened that night. The lame walked, the deaf heard, certainly the spirit soared. My name is Father Owen Lee. I wasn't in Vienna that night, nor at any of the other performances I've just mentioned. But I have attended a performance of Fidelio in Switzerland, at which refugees wept, in Austria, at which there was a great shout to free Rudolf Hess, in Berlin, just a few blocks from the wall, in Munich, where the emphasis was shifted to make the jailer the central figure, a good German won by human feeling to oppose oppression. Not all of these performances were notable in themselves, nor could I subscribe wholeheartedly to every sentiment expressed. But any performance of Fidelio near a border where people are still imprisoned for their political views, or in a city that has such experience in living memory, any performance anywhere that conveys even a fraction of the work's power and passion and profound humanity is a liberating experience. As an opera, Fidelio is far from perfect. Beethoven makes cruel demands on his singers and on some of his instrumentalists, and moves in the course of the work from Singspiel to music drama to melodrama to oratorio. Though the libretto is based on an actual incident in the French Revolution that had already been set to music by other composers, and though the action is not unlike a number of successful rescue plays of the day, the subject now seems improbable, even contrived. Some of the text comes perilously close to doggerel, and the subplot is something of an embarrassment. But these fairly obvious faults have been given more than their fair share of attention. What really matters is that Beethoven's mighty spirit was stirred by the libretto's central concept, political oppression overcome by courage. And he was at least as much moved by the idea of a woman's utterly committed love for her husband. Beethoven was deeply convinced by these ideas and wrote a pride of lion-like music to express them. For years he labored over Fidelio, casting and recasting his thoughts in half-finished Michelangelesque shapes, heaping overture on mighty overture. What remains is like the series of rough-hewn figures that lead the traveler through the Accademia in Florence to the finished David. Like those mighty figures, Fidelio is craggy and unpolished and immensely powerful. If Fidelio is still unappreciated in parts of America, some of the fault is surely ours. Even in the text, there are many good things that have been overlooked or misunderstood or unthinkingly condescended to, perhaps because in recent decades our own art has not valued highly such things as sacrifice, marital fidelity, courage, hope, and the commitment to freedom. But now that fewer anti-heroes and opportunists dominate our plays and novels and films, now that we have re-examined our attitudes toward the military and political aspirations of our own country, we may be more ready to sense what Beethoven found inspiring in his libretto. He certainly responded, and for reasons we shall soon see, to the words of the prisoner who says, "What is asked of me is hard, but God's will is just," and to the words of the liberator who says, "Let every man look to his brother and help him if he can." There are a dozen such lines in Fidelio's libretto that cut right to the heart of living. The text is based on a French drama by Jean-Nicolas Bouilly, done into homely German by Schubert's friend Joseph Sonnleitner, revised by some of Beethoven's friends, and finally whipped into shape by the practical librettist Georg Friedrich Treitschke. Most of the libretto is primer simple. "O my Leonora, what have you done for me?" "Nothing, nothing, my Florestan." I have heard sophisticates laugh at that exchange, but it can be immensely moving when spoken with conviction in the intervals between the powerful musical statements. I, for one, have always been impressed by the way certain words, Freiheit, Pflicht, Leben, Liebe, Augenblick, and inevitably Gott, that is to say, freedom, duty, life, love, moment, and inevitably God, run through the libretto with leitmotivic force. In their German form, those words have all but become, for me, Beethoven words. Beethoven responded, too, to his characters. Leonora was the only heroine who spoke to him from all the many librettos he considered. He thought for a while of setting a subject suggested by Emanuel Schikaneder, librettist of Mozart's Magic Flute, on the faithfulness of a Vestal Virgin. He also began sketches for operas on Lady Macbeth, on Gretchen, the seduced girl who finally saves Goethe's Faust, and on Homer's faithful Penelope. But only Leonora really spoke to him, and he makes her speak to us. We know what Lotte Lehmann meant when she wrote, "What joy to impersonate such a human role. I found in it the most exalted moments of my opera career, and was shaken by it to the depths of my being." Fidelio did not come easily to Beethoven. "Of all my children," he remembered at the end of his life, "this was born in the greatest labor and caused me the most sorrow. And for that reason," he added, "it is the child most dear to me." It took Beethoven 12 years, 3 versions, 4 overtures, and 346 pages of sketchbook to bring Fidelio to completion. I don't think we need concern ourselves here with the alternate versions, though one of them has been successfully recorded. And I think we can leave the overtures to the concert halls, where all four of them are still played. The greatest of the overtures by far, in fact Ernest Newman calls it the greatest thing of its kind ever written, is the Leonora Overture No. 3. It is virtually the whole opera in concentrated form and immensely exciting. Many audiences don't feel that they've heard Fidelio unless it is played at some point in the course of the evening. But Beethoven himself soon realized that it would overwhelm the theatrical end of things, and in the end he substituted a piece less than half its length to raise the curtain. The Fidelio Overture. Brisk, emphatic, instantly evocative of the tonal world of the opera to follow. We hear right at the start the searing strings and urgent kettle drum beats that forever after mean Fidelio to all lovers of Beethoven. And thereafter we hear the French horns that symbolize hope, and the oboe that is associated with the heroine, instruments that receive pride of place in the opera to follow. When the curtain rises, we are in the courtyard of a prison near Seville in 18th century Spain. Though the main events we shall see actually happened during the Reign of Terror in France, and Beethoven surely intended the action to apply as well to his German-speaking lands, Spain was, at that time, the remote land where a political drama could be safely set and its action universalized. We see a high wall with watchtowers, a gate, the massive doors that lead to the cells, barred and bolted, and in the foreground we see, with some surprise, a little house with a carefully tended garden. Life goes on as normally as possible in this grim setting for the jailer, Rocco, and his daughter, Marcelina. She's a pretty girl, just old enough to be doing the ironing. And we get a homely, gemütlich opening, a duet for two young people before the main business begins. For a quite ordinary young man named Giacchino is Rocco's assistant, and he has quite expectedly fallen in love with the only bit of femininity in the place. Just now he has found himself alone with Marcelina. He can ask her again about marriage. She's not interested at all. 9999. while he has to keep running to the prison gate to look after deliveries. It's all familiar comic stuff, common coin on the German Singspiel stage, but it's hardly what we expected to find at the beginning of a serious opera by the mighty Beethoven. Here are Gerhard Unger and Ingeborg Hallstein.
Wann hörst du dein Ja-Wort gegeben? Es könnte ja heute noch sein. Und welche Verbindung hat mein Leben? Jetzt, morgen und immer nein. Und immer nein. Du bist doch wahrhaftig und Stein. Du bist doch wahrhaftig und Stein. Kein Wünschen, kein Bitten, kein Bitten, kein Bitten ist ein. So hart mit dem Sein, er hofft bei dem Schein.
Giacchino is called off to his duties. The music stops, and in the tradition of the Singspiel, spoken dialogue takes over briefly. Marcelina, left alone, tells us why she can't accept her sorry little suitor. Oh, she liked him all right for a while, but then another boy, much more mature in his outlook, came to work at the prison. His name is Fidelio. And it is he, she sings, she will one day marry. They'll live in a house of their own, work hard all day, and, though she blushes to think of it, snuggle up at night. For those hopes, modest though they are, Beethoven sets his French horns singing. Marcelina's father Rocco comes in, and with him more spoken dialogue. Rocco is a gentleman for a jailer, kind with his bumbling assistant Giacchino, and anxiously awaiting the return of the dependable Fidelio, who has been sent off to get the day's post. "Here he is," cries Marcelina, and we get our first glimpse of this admirable young man. He's poorly dressed, and weary with toting not just the post in a dispatch box at his side, but some heavy prison chains just repaired slung over his shoulder. Marcelina runs to wipe his brow. Rocco quietly expresses his gratitude to this youth who has been such a help to him and would make such a good match for his daughter. And Giacchino is understandably unhappy about it all. As for Beethoven, he illuminates the little situation with music of unparalleled sympathy. He gives each of the characters a little soliloquy, speaking, or rather singing, to themselves. Their voices enter singly, but soon the four voices blend. The four characters sing, not an ordinary operatic quartet, but a canon. Each character in turn takes up the same musical phrase and develops it. First Marcelina sings, "Mir ist so wunderbar." To me it's so wonderful that Fidelio loves me. Then Fidelio sings, "She's falling in love with me. This can ruin everything." Then Rocco sings, "What a nice couple they'd make." Then, as the music swells, Giacchino says he just can't bear the thought of losing his love to his rival. The new singers there were Gottlob Frick as Rocco, and, as young Fidelio himself, the soprano Christa Ludwig. You sometimes hear it said that that quartet, however moving it may be as music, is all wrong dramatically. Beethoven did not think to individuate his four characters with separate melodies, as, for example, Verdi does in Rigoletto. In one sense, the criticism is well taken, for the words indicate that each character is caught up in a different emotion, and the situation seems intended to be partly serious and partly comic. Beethoven, critics say, ought to have written 4 distinct melodies for the 4 characters. But in the most important sense, Beethoven is right. The words to the quartet are probably the low point in the libretto from a literary or dramatic standpoint. Beethoven, with, I think, sure dramatic instinct, chooses not to set them to music that will illuminate the maladroit words, but to set each character singing to the same melody. So, as the 4 stand motionless and each in turn takes up that simple but wonderful tune, we feel the single-minded hope of Fidelio ennoble the other 3. This quartet at the beginning of the opera predicts the resolution of the final scene. where Fidelio's noble spirit will touch and change Giacchino's self-centeredness and Marcellina's superficial notions of love and Rocco's cowardice and materialism. Yes, Rocco is a less than perfect man. He soon shows how limited his views are when he advises the boy Fidelio that the most important thing in a good marriage is having money.
Hat man nicht auch Gold bei Lieben, kann man nicht ganz glücklich sein. Traurig lebt sich fort das Leben, mancher Kummer stellt sich ein, mancher Kummer stellt sich ein.
Then, in spoken dialogue again, Fidelio answers Rocco, the most important thing in marriage is the union of two loving hearts. The boy then makes a strange request. He wants to visit the lowest part of the prison. Rocco, when he descends there, always comes back exhausted. Can't he be of help? Rocco admits that his age makes work deep in the prison very difficult, but he has the strictest orders not to admit anyone to the lowest dungeon. Marcellina asks, innocently enough, "You mean to that prisoner you're always talking about?" Rocco's conscience, we gather, has bothered him especially about this man in solitary confinement. Fidelio, with sudden urgency, asks, "How long has he been imprisoned?" "More than 2 years," Rocco answers. 2 years, Fidelio exclaims. "He must have committed some great crime." "Or else," Rocco answers sadly, "he has great enemies. As it is, I don't think he can hold out much longer. For the past month, under orders of the governor, Don Pizarro, I've reduced his daily rations, and he has no light, no straw to lie on, nothing at all." "Oh, Father," says Marcellina, "don't take Fidelio down there." "Why not?" Fidelio exclaims. "I have courage, ich habe Mut," and we get a trio. This time the characters are delineated separately in the music before they blend their voices. It shows that Beethoven could have written Mir ist so wunderbar in the conventional way had he so chosen. Here he depicts Fidelio as steeled to face the worst in the prison below, Marcellina as sure that the love in her eyes will be stronger than any of the hate Fidelio will see there, and Rocco says to Fidelio, and it sounds sinister after our memories of prison camps in our century, "That's right, my boy. Your heart will gradually harden. You'll get used to seeing terrible things."
Hab immer Mut, dann wird's dir auch gelingen. Das Herz wird wach durch Gegenwart, bei fürchterlichen Dingen. Ganz sicher bauen. Du darfst mir auch ins Auge schauen,
we hear a military march, a jaunty piece, yet there is something strangely menacing, even inhuman, about it. The effect is achieved by the contrabassoon pumping away in the bass, and by the strange off-the-beat accentuation in the kettle drums. Later, when we descend to the lowest dungeon in the prison, those same instruments will make particularly gruesome contributions to the orchestral coloring. Here, they are only vaguely disconcerting, as they accompany the jack-boots. This is no ordinary prison. Don Pizarro himself follows his guard into the courtyard. He inspects the daily post, discards most of it, but starts at the handwriting on one of the envelopes, opens it, and reads, "I am writing to inform you that the minister has learned that in the state prisons under your supervision there are victims of arbitrary oppression. He is leaving Seville tomorrow to make a surprise investigation." "My God," Pizarro exclaims, "if he should discover that I have Florestan here! The minister thought him dead all this time. Well, there's a solution to that." And then, as the strings swirl menacingly around him, Pizarro, Walter Berry on our recording, sings, "What a moment this is! He thought he had me once. Now I can twist the steel in his heart and shout triumph in his ear as he dies."
Welchen Augenblick die Rache will dich fühlen, dich rufe kein Geschick in seinem Herzen fühlen. O Wonne, großes Glück, in seinem Herzen fühlen. O Wonne, großes Glück.
Pizarro sets a guard to stand on the towers, with special orders to his trumpeter to watch the road from Seville and signal the approach of a carriage with outriders. Anyone who fails in his duty will answer with his head. Then Pizarro summons Rocco, throws him a purse, and tells him that, for reasons of state, he must kill the prisoner in solitary far below. Rocco is horrified. The taking of life is not one of my duties. "Are you a man?" Pizarro asks, with contempt. Special contempt, for Rocco holds on to the purse. "Oh, go and dig the grave," Pizarro says. "Give a signal when you're done, and I'll come down and kill him myself." Rocco silences his conscience with the thought that the poor prisoner will at last find rest in death. Pizarro only regrets that his captive's ordeal was so short. For the rest, he is exultant. Here is the end of that duet from the last century that has been repeated in real life, tragically, in this century of ours.
Hast du mich verstanden? Du gibst ein Zeichen, dann werd ich selbst vermummt, wie in den Kerker schleichen. Ein Stoß und ihr verschwand. Ich hör wie seinen Hören, vor kurzer Weile ein, sein Tod
The two men enter the fortress. Young Fidelio has overheard. "You monster," he shouts after Pizarro. "Where are you hurrying to? What are you thinking of?" Isn't there any compassion, any human feeling in your heart? But if your heart is seething with wrath, a rainbow shines on me through the clouds. It shines so clear. It calls to mind our days of peace. And it calms my heart. Come, hope, oh come to me. I think the plot synopses make a mistake when they tell us right from the start that the stalwart young Fidelio is actually a woman in disguise. In fact, the solitary prisoner's wife, Florestan's faithful Leonora, come in courage and hope to find him if she can, and set him free. Beethoven always wanted to call the opera Leonora. It was only because 2 other operas on the subject had just appeared under that name that he let himself be persuaded to call his opera Fidelio. I think he wanted us to wonder about the identity of his protagonist right up to the moment when he summons 4 obbligato horn voices to surround Fidelio as he sees hope rising like a rainbow from the depths of suffering. At that moment, we realize that this is no idealistic young man. This is woman at her most fearless. This is, at least partly, the eternal feminine, das ewig Weibliche, as Goethe called it, the womanly ideal that frees a man from the prison of himself. This is also conjugal love, something Beethoven himself hoped in vain all his life to know. Fidelio, or as we will henceforth call the opera's great central figure, Leonora, now sings that Gattenliebe, her love for her husband, will save him.
Ich folgte jener Triebe, ich war nicht, ich stand die
Fidelio has by now changed completely from its charmingly comic Singspiel opening. We are close now to Wagnerian music drama, and if we haven't yet been moved to tears, they are not far away. Leonora asks Rocco to let the poor prisoners out into the courtyard to feel the sunlight on their faces. Marcelina pleads too, saying that the governor owes them this favor. Rocco, thinking of the terrible crime that he will soon be implicated in, salves his conscience and takes the risk. The great prison doors open, and the prisoners, political prisoners of an unjust regime, come stumbling upwards into the light. Leonora anxiously scans the faces of the prisoners as they file past, but does not find the one she is seeking, a powerful effect Wagner used in Tannhäuser and Verdi in Aida. Those composers are thought to be greater men of the theater than Beethoven, who is not supposed to have had a true sense of the dramatic. But in fact, so sure is Beethoven's dramatic instinct that in the midst of his prisoner's chorus he creates two unforgettable characters, each with only a single bit of text to sing. One of the prisoners, a young man, tells the others with almost unbearable pathos, "Let us put our trust in God's help and build on that. I still hear hope saying softly to me, we will be free. We will find peace. We will find peace." Then an older prisoner cautions, "Speak softly. Get back. We are being watched and overheard." Bruno Walter, who knew what it was to suffer under an oppressive regime, always cast the young prisoner with the greatest care and affection, for that young prisoner sounds what Walter called the principal issue of our time and the theme of Beethoven's Fidelio, Freiheit, freedom. When Walter fled the Anschluss and came to New York to conduct Fidelio at the Metropolitan, he was overjoyed to hear that he would have Kirsten Flagstad as Leonora, but he hastened to ask, "And who will sing the first prisoner?" He also said that, all the time he fled the Nazis, the warning of the second prisoner, "Softly, you are being watched and overheard," sounded over and over in his head. Here are the two prisoners, Kurt Verschitz and Raymond Wolanski, with their only lines. Leonora learns from Rocco that the governor has given permission for the two of them to descend to the lowest part of the prison. She shivers when she hears why. Florestan is to be murdered that very day. Though she tries to fight them back, the tears come. "You stay up here," Rocco says paternally. "I'll go down alone." "No," says Leonora, "I'm coming with you. I have to see him, even if I must die myself." Rocco might then have guessed that there was a special bond between his assistant and the prisoner. But he hasn't time to guess, for suddenly he has a crisis on his hands. Pizarro has heard that the other prisoners have been let out into the light, and he is furious. Rocco offers, as an excuse, that it is the king's name day, and he quietly reminds Pizarro that the terrible act they must commit against one prisoner almost obligates them to do this act of kindness to the others. Pizarro is unmoved, and in the end the prisoners obediently stumble back to their cells. Act 1 ends with compassionate chords and a quiet shudder in the kettle drums. In Act 2, we find ourselves in the lower depths of the prison, where hardly any light can penetrate. For a long time we seem to be moving, searching through this terrible place, turning dark corners, crossing bridges over nothingness. Beethoven leads us onwards with a long orchestral introduction, ominous kettle drum beats, screams of pain from the winds and brass, compassionate prayers from the string choir, and then a prisoner, John Vickers in our recording, shouts out in despair, "Gott, welch Dunkel hier!" God, what darkness here, and what a deadly silence. It is Florestan chained to the wall. Florestan is, for me, the great character in the opera. A just man defeated in the springtime of life, his only offense daring to speak the truth. He faces his fate with words that, without Beethoven's music, might seem impossibly overstated, but with that music are altogether convincing, true, and moving. I do not complain, he says to his God. The measure of my suffering is in your hands. My heart is comforted with the thought that I have done my duty. I accept the pain. I accept dying here in dishonor. I cannot hear John Vickers or any Florestan sing this without hearing the voice of Beethoven himself. Come when thou wilt, the composer says to death in his Heiligenstadt Testament. I shall meet thee bravely. Beethoven wrote those words in the midst of his Eroica, Waldstein, and Appassionata years, when he was 28 and, like Florestan, in the springtime of life, and realized that the darkness and stillness were closing in on him. He was going deaf. And in the letters he wrote through the various revisions of Fidelio, we read over and over sentiments like those of the suffering Florestan. I should be happy, perhaps one of the happiest of men, if this demon had not taken possession of my ears. If I had not read somewhere that a good man may not voluntarily part with his life, so long as a good deed remains for him to perform, I should long ago have been no more, and indeed by my own hand. And again, on the realization that he would never share his life with a woman who loved him, he wrote, Submission, absolute submission to your fate, only this can make you capable of the sacrifice duty demands of you. O harter Kampf, O hard struggle. Similarly, Florestan sings, O schwere Prüfung, O heavy trial, and yet God's will, Gottes Wille, is just. It wrings the heart. Fidelio marks a midpoint in what J.W.N. Sullivan, in a famous book, called Beethoven's spiritual development. Fidelio comes between the early symphonies, where Sullivan says the composer finds the meaning of life is achieved in spite of suffering, and the last quartets, where he finds the meaning of life through suffering. At the end, Beethoven accepted suffering almost as a blessing. But in his middle period, when he wrote Fidelio, his response to suffering was simple submission. And that is the note Florestan sounds unforgettably in Fidelio. The suffering prisoner remembers his past in a strain familiar to those who know the Leonora No. 3 overture. In his Heiligenstadt Testament, Beethoven wrote, O Providence, grant me but one day of pure joy. It is so long since real joy echoed in my heart. Oh when, my God, shall I find it again? Never? Oh, that would be too hard. In the opera, as an oboe melody appears and hovers over a quickened orchestra, Florestan rises to his feet and seems to see his wife Leonora come like an angel to lead him to freedom, zur Freiheit, not in this world, but in the next.
Ich finde, sonst säuseln der Luft. Und ist nicht mein Grab ihre Helle, ist sie wie ein Engel im rosigen Duft, sich tröstend zur Seite gespannt. Ein Leonoren, der Garten sogleich hier, der führt mich zur Freiheit ins Himmlische Reich. Unspürlich, ich finde, sonst säuselnde Luft, ist sie wie ein Engel im rosigen Duft, ein Engel sich tröstend zur Seite gestellt. Ein Engel Leonoren, der Garten sogleich hier, der führt mich zur Freiheit, ins himmlische Reich, zur Freiheit, ins himmlische Reich, der führt mich zur Freiheit, ins himmlische Reich, zur Freiheit, ins himmlische Reich, ins himmlische Reich, ins himmlische Reich.
The excitement of this is too much for Florestan, and as the vision of Leonora fades, he falls unconscious to his dungeon floor, his head buried in his hands. Then, as Florestan saw in his vision, Leonora does appear, still dressed as a boy, come with Rocco to dig the grave of the man she is almost sure is her missing husband. Over frightening orchestral phrases, Rocco and Leonora speak. This speaking over music is known technically as melodrama, and no one before or after, not even Mozart or Verdi, used it better than Beethoven does here. How cold it is, Leonora whispers. Yes, we're in the deepest vaults. I thought we'd never find the way down. There's the prisoner. He doesn't seem to be moving at all. Maybe he's dead. Can you mean it? No, says Rocco as he comes close to the slumped body. Schläft. He's sleeping. Let's get to work. I can't make out his features, says Leonora. God be with me if it's him.
Wie kalt ist es in diesem unterirdischen Gewölbe.
Das ist natürlich, das ist ja tief.
Ich glaubte schon, wir würden den Eingang gar nicht finden.
Da ist er.
Er scheint ganz ohne Bewegung.
Vielleicht ist er tot.
Ihr meint es?
Nein, er schläft.
leiden. Gott, steh mir bei, wenn es ist.
They work away, clearing an abandoned well to make a grave, to a sinister figure in the bass instruments, strings and contrabassoon. And here is where the opera begins to take on its universal significances. Leonora resolves to risk everything to save the prisoner, even if he turns out not to be her husband. For no human being, she says, should have to undergo such degradation. Whoever you are, she sings, I will save you. I swear by God you shall not die. I will loosen your chains. I will set you free, you poor man. Suddenly, as the music stops, the prisoner stirs in his sleep. Leonora sees him raise his head. Rocco approaches him. The two men speak. Leonora thinks she recognizes her husband's voice. Then he turns his face, and she exclaims, God, it is him. She hears her husband almost despair when he is told that, yes, it is his sworn enemy Pizarro who is in charge of the prison. And she hears her husband plead with Rocco to send word to Seville, to Leonora. That's impossible, Rocco says. It would ruin me and do you no good. Florestan asks for water, and Leonora comes running up with a flask of wine. He drinks. Rocco says to his assistant, You are moved by his suffering. Leonora answers, Who wouldn't be? You are too, Master Rocco. I am, comes the reply. The man has a voice that... Yes, Leonora finishes the sentence, a voice that sounds in the depths of your heart. Florestan does not recognize his wife in his weakness and in the pervading darkness, but he prays. As the music starts up again, May you be rewarded in a better world, for heaven itself has sent you here to me. Rocco explains that he is only doing his duty. He has wanted to help the prisoner too, but doing so was strictly forbidden, and they had better not offer the prisoner any more sustenance. But Leonora, and here is where we'll begin our musical example, Leonora offers her husband a bit of bread she has brought. He sings, "O dank, dear, dank, O dank. Oh, thank you, and again, you'll be rewarded in a better world." When the grave is ready, Rocco walks to the foot of the staircase and gives the signal, a sharp whistle. We'll want to hear the spoken dialogue here. Florestan screams, "Is that the signal for my death?" "No," Leonora assures him, "keep calm." He says, in near despair, "Oh, my Leonora, shall I never see you again?" She says, and many a great Leonora has found her most memorable spoken moment here, "Whatever happens, remember that Providence directs our course. Ja, es gibt eine Vorsehung. Yes, there is a Providence."
Wo geht hin? Ist das der Vorbote meines Todes?
Nein, nein, beruhige dich, lieber Gefangener.
Oh, meine Leonore, so soll ich dich nie wiedersehen.
Mein ganzes Herz reißt mich zu ihm hin. Sei ruhig, sage ich dir. Was du auch hören und sehen magst, vergiss nicht, dass überall eine Vorsehung herrscht. Ja, ja, es gibt eine Vorsehung.
Pizarro descends with his cloak drawn over his face and the muttered resolve that, once the prisoner is out of the way, the other two witnesses will have to go too. He gives Rocco the order, "Unchain him from the rock." Then he casts off his cloak. Let him learn who his torturer is, I, Pizarro, whom he tried to destroy. "You're a murderer," Florestan says fearlessly. Pizarro lunges at him, and Leonora runs between them, shielding Florestan's body with her own. "First, kill his wife," she shouts. It's a thrilling moment. "Yes," she says to the three astonished men, "I am Leonora." Pizarro is then ready to kill both husband and wife, and Leonora draws a pistol and says, "Another sound, and you are dead." At that same moment, as if called forth by Leonora's courageous act, the trumpet from the watchtower high above announces that the minister has been sighted approaching.
Vater Rocco, der Herr Minister ist angekommen. Sein Gefolge wartet schon im Schlosshof.
Gelobt sei Gott.
That's Giacchino shouting that the minister has arrived, and Rocco exclaiming, "Praise be to God, for a great weight has been lifted from his conscience." Pizarro rushes off in confusion, and Florestan and Leonora are left alone, and it is here that they speak their two immensely moving lines, the last lines of spoken dialogue in the opera. "Oh, my Leonora, what have you done for me?" "Nothing, nothing, my Florestan." Then, falling into each other's arms, they burst into exultant song, to hymn their Namen namenlose Freude, their ineffable, inexpressible joy.
Oh, meine Leonore, was hast du für mich getan?
Nichts, nichts, mein Florestan.
Together they thank God for their happiness. The curtain falls on that quiet close, and it is here that, ever since Gustav Mahler, it has become traditional in many houses to play the mighty Leonora No. 3. I love that overture, but I'm not happy with the practice of inserting it here. It starts with a descent into the prison from which we have just found release. It repeats much of the music we have already heard, music written for situations we have already passed through. If you have ever seen the opera move triumphantly from O Namen namenlose Freude directly to the great final scene, you'll know how much it gains dramatically without the forward-moving action being delayed by the recapitulation that the famous overture at this point can only be. There are many who agree with me on this, but I must in honesty say that there are many more who want the Leonora No. 3 and make the rafters ring when it comes to its triumphant conclusion. For the final scene there is a sudden burst of sunlight. We are on the parade ground of the castle. In most productions, a massive drawbridge is lowered, and the prisoners rush into the arms of their families. Then they all kneel before the minister, Don Fernando, to plead for justice, and he proclaims a general amnesty. Kneel no more like slaves. I am no tyrant. I am a brother, come to his brothers, to help them gladly if he can. This true minister of justice is sung here by Franz Krass. Rocco pushes his way through the sentries, bringing Leonora and Florestan, whose hands are still in chains. The minister is astonished to see before him the patriot and friend whom he had long thought dead. But Rocco insists that the wife, who dressed as a boy and faced danger so fearlessly, is equally heroic. Marcelina and Giacchino are astonished at the revelations, and this example of courageous love sends them quietly into each other's arms, where they should have been all along. Pizarro tries to exonerate himself, or at least to take Rocco with him to his fate. But Rocco can only stumble out a few words to the effect that his heart was with Leonora, not with Pizarro. It is Pizarro that townspeople and prisoners cry out against, and he is led away to judgment. The minister says grimly to Rocco, "You opened up the grave for this noble man. You're the one who should remove his chains." Then, with the sudden thought that, symbolically, it is far more important to exalt Leonora's courage than to expose Rocco's complicity, the minister tells Rocco to wait, and asks Leonora herself to remove Florestan's chains. It is an ineffable moment. Wife and husband, the freer and the freed, all pray, "O God, your design is just. You try us, but you do not forsake us." Then there's a moment of silence, and Beethoven sweeps us into that most affirmative of keys, C major, for a chorus second only to his own Ode to Joy in the Ninth Symphony, for its ecstatic praise of human goodness, and, here especially, of the wife who saved her husband's life. That ending is so joyous, so unambiguous, so affirmative, that it may seem wrong-headed to ask, as one asks at the end of the Magic Flute or Parsifal, what does it mean? All the same, I'd like to end this discussion with a few remarks about wider significances in Fidelio. A dozen or so years ago, the English theologian Hamish Swanston, in his book In Defense of Opera, suggested that Beethoven meant the sounding of the trumpet above Pizarro's prison at the moment of rescue as a symbol for the trumpet of the Last Judgment. Similarly, the composer Ernst Bloch heard in the trumpet at the top of the castle a tuba mirum spargens sonum, the trump that the Dies Irae in the Requiem Mass says will sound on the last day. A close inspection of the text will support these apocalyptic readings. At the sound of that trumpet, Florestan and Leonora acknowledge the intervention of heaven. Pizarro exclaims at the closeness of hell. Rocco sings that God is coming in judgment. It is all there in the words as much as it is in the music. We can go further. Leonora, steeling her husband to face his enemy, also touches on the theological when she says, "Whatever happens, remember that there is a supreme providence." And the final scene, the liberation scene that follows on the trumpet call to judgment, is a symbolic reenactment of Judgment Day itself. Leonora is hailed by the people over and over as Retterin, Savior. God, in his human agent, Don Fernando, dispenses justice and mercy. What the Bible promises that the Lord in judgment will someday do for us, Don Fernando does for those freed from their living tombs. He wipes all tears from their eyes. And in a flood of triumphant music, men and women, one hopes even the men and women in the theater, are strengthened in the symbolic enactment of the promise that death shall be no more, nor mourning, nor weeping, for the former things are passed away. But the most beautiful of these religious echoes, and one I don't recall anyone ever remarking on, comes not on the castle top, but in its depths. Florestan is sentenced to die. He asks only for water, but Leonora brings him those sacramental substances, bread and wine. Is there a Eucharistic significance intended? Almost surely, for when Florestan receives the bread and wine, he stammers, "Dank dir, dank, o dank, o dank." And Beethoven's hymn-like music reminds us that the word Eucharist is ordinary Greek for that repeated word, dank, thank you. Efcharisto, perhaps the most familiar word the traveler hears in Greece today, is the name Christians since the 1st century have given to the most beautiful of their rituals. Florestan had seen Leonora in a vision come to lead him to paradise. When Leonora actually appears to save him, she gives him the signs of his communion with the God he prayed to in his suffering. At that point, this listener at least cannot but remember the words Jesus promised he would say to those on his right hand on the day of judgment. "I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was in prison, and you came to me." And on that day we will ask him, "Lord, when? When did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we come to you in prison?" And he will say, "As often as you did those kind things to the lowest of my brothers, you did them to me." It was for her husband that Leonora performed those works of mercy, yes, but she would have done them for any unfortunate. Before she was certain that the prisoner was her Florestan, she sang, "Whoever you are, I will save you. I swear by God you shall not die. I will loose your chains. I will set you free. du armer Mann. Again and again, says Ernest Newman, Beethoven lifts us to a height from which we reevaluate not only all music, but all life, all emotion, and all thought. I'd add to that, he shows us the true meaning of the most sacred things in life, which are, in the end, the most ordinary things, the things that make us human. The greatness of Beethoven's vision is realized in Fidelio as surely as it was to be in the Missa Solemnis and the last piano sonatas and quartets, works more profound, but not more human, than this, his only opera. The Ninth Symphony especially reminds us how Beethoven's musical output continues through the years in one consistent onward spiral. The music of the Ninth Symphony's final choral movement continually suggests Fidelio's great liberation scene, and even some of the words of Schiller's Ode to Joy in the Ninth Symphony found their way into Fidelio years earlier. Let him who has found a true wife join us in our joy. Beethoven's music has the power to lift us to where we can survey all of life and what it means, because he was human as we are, but writ ineffably larger, because he believed mightily in the ideals in which we would like mightily to believe, the equality and brotherhood of all humankind, the loving interdependence of man and woman, the just providence of God, and perhaps above all, the resilience of the human spirit in the face of oppression and tyranny.